The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the hills of Burlington, Vermont, when Harold Thompson woke up in his small, tidy house. At 93 years old, he followed the same routine every day, and this morning was no different. His alarm clock showed 6 o'clock a.m. when he slowly sat up in his bed, his joints creaking like old floorboards. Harold's bedroom walls were covered with black and white photographs from his younger days. There he was, standing proud in his military uniform, surrounded by fellow soldiers who had become like brothers to him during the war. Now, so many years later, he was the only one left from his unit who could still tell their stories. After washing up and putting on his favorite brown sweater and comfortable gray pants, Harold looked at himself in the mirror. His face showed every one of his 93 years, with deep wrinkles that told stories of both joy and sadness. His white hair was still neatly combed, just as he had done it during his military days. Even now, some habits never changed. At exactly 6:45 a.m., Harold picked up his polished wooden cane from beside his bed. The cane was a gift from his late wife, Martha, who had given it to him on their 50th wedding anniversary 10 years ago. He held it tight, feeling the smooth wood under his fingers, and started his daily walk to May's Diner. The walk wasn't long, just 3 blocks, but for Harold, it was an important part of his day. He would stop to say hello to Mrs. Peterson, who was always watering her flowers, and wave to young Tommy, who delivered newspapers on his bicycle. These small interactions kept him connected to his community, something that became more important after Martha passed away. May's Diner sat on the corner of Maple and Pine Streets, its red and white sign slightly faded but still welcoming. The building had been there for over 40 years, and Harold had been coming here every single day for the past 15 years. The bell above the door rang cheerfully as he pushed it open at exactly 7 o'clock a.m. "Good morning, Harold," called out Susan May, the owner. She was the daughter of the original May, and she had practically grown up watching Harold come to the diner. She already had his coffee ready, black with just a splash of cream, served in his special blue mug that they kept just for him. Harold made his way to his corner booth, the one with the best view of both the street and the mountains in the distance. The vinyl seats were a bit worn, but they were comfortable, like an old friend. He placed his cane carefully against the wall and settled into his spot, his bones grateful for the rest after the walk. The morning crowd at May's was always the same. There was Bob, the local mailman, having his breakfast before starting his route. Sarah, the high school teacher, would come in for her morning tea and bagel. And then there were the truck drivers who stopped by for coffee and eggs before hitting the road. They all knew Harold, and he knew them. As Harold sipped his coffee, he would watch the town wake up through the large windows. He saw parents walking their children to school, shop owners opening their stores, and dogs taking their morning walks with their owners. This view from his corner booth was like watching a daily show that never got old. Sometimes, younger customers would ask Harold why he came to the diner every day at the same time. He would smile and tell them that routine keeps a person young at heart. But the truth was, May's Diner was more than just a place to have breakfast. It was where he felt closest to Martha. They had shared so many meals in this very booth. It was where he could still feel part of the world, even as it changed around him. Susan would refill his coffee cup without him asking, and they would chat about small things: the weather, her children's school activities, or the latest town news. Harold didn't say much, but his eyes would twinkle when he listened to the stories of everyday life happening around him. For 2 hours every morning, this corner booth was Harold's command center, his quiet place to observe and remember, to be both part of the community and apart from it. Little did he know that this peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge that would change everything. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything changed at May's Diner. The leaves outside had turned golden and red, and a cool breeze swept through the streets of Burlington. Harold was enjoying his second cup of coffee when the peaceful morning shattered like a broken plate. First came the sound, a deep, thundering roar that made the diner's windows shake. Then 5 motorcycles, gleaming black and chrome, pulled into the parking lot. The machines were huge and powerful, with silver skulls decorated on their fuel tanks. The noise was so loud that Sarah, the teacher, almost spilled her tea, and Bob the mailman stopped mid-bite of his toast. The bikers who walked in weren't just big, they were huge. The first one through the door had to turn sideways just to fit his shoulders through. They wore black leather jackets covered in patches, heavy boots that thudded against the floor, and chains that jingled when they walked. Their leader, A man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos scanned the diner like he was sizing up his new territory. Susan May, who had been wiping down the counter, straightened up and tried to smile. "Welcome to May's Diner, gentlemen. How can I help you today?" The leader grinned, showing a gold tooth. "Table for 5, sweetheart. And make it quick." His voice was rough, like gravel being crushed. The other customers tried not to stare, but everyone could feel the change in the air. It was like a storm cloud had rolled into their sunny morning. The only space big enough for 5 people was the cluster of tables near Harold's corner booth. Susan had no choice but to seat them there. The bikers dragged chairs around, the metal legs scraping loudly against the floor. They spread out their maps on the tables and started talking in loud voices about their road plans. Harold sat very still in his booth, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. One of the younger bikers, who had spikes on his jacket, noticed the old man and nudged his friend. They both smirked. Harold could hear them whispering and laughing, and though he couldn't make out the words, he knew they were talking about him. The next morning, the bikers were back, and the morning after that. They started calling themselves the Road Raiders, and May's Diner became their new meeting spot. They would arrive just after 7:30 a.m., right in the middle of Harold's peaceful morning routine. Regular customers started changing their schedules. Sarah began coming in earlier for her tea. Bob switched to getting coffee from the gas station. Even the truck drivers found other places to stop. But Harold didn't change his routine. He had faced bigger challenges in his life than a group of noisy bikers. The Road Raiders seemed to take Harold's presence as a personal challenge. They would rev their engines extra loud in the parking lot, knowing the noise bothered him. When they walked past his booth, they would bump it hard enough to make his coffee ripple. Sometimes they would throw their heavy jackets onto his table's empty seat without asking. Susan tried her best to keep the peace. "Gentlemen," she would say, her voice firm but polite, "please be mindful of our other customers." But the bikers would just laugh and say they were just having fun or livening up this boring place. Harold never complained. He would simply adjust his coffee cup when they bumped his table, or carefully move their jackets to another seat when they threw them near him. His face remained calm, but his eyes, those sharp blue eyes that had seen war and peace, love and loss, they told a different story. One morning, a new motorcycle joined the group. This one was bigger than the others, with red flames painted on its sides. Its rider was the largest man Harold had ever seen, even bigger than the current leader. The others called him Crusher, and it was easy to see why. When Crusher walked into the diner, the whole building seemed to shrink around him. Crusher took one look at Harold's corner booth and a cruel smile spread across his face. He whispered something to the group's leader, who nodded and grinned. Harold could tell by their expressions that things were about to get worse, much worse. The peaceful mornings at May's Diner had become a thing of the past, and for the first time in years, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since his days in the war, the quiet tension before a storm. The next few weeks at May's Diner felt like walking on eggshells. Every morning, when Harold made his way to his corner booth, he could feel the bikers' eyes following him. They had turned their harassment into a game, competing to see who could make the old man most uncomfortable without actually touching him. Crusher had become the unofficial leader of these games. He was smart about it, always staying just within the limits of what could be excused as accidents or coincidences. When he would walk past Harold's table, his heavy leather jacket would accidentally sweep Harold's silverware onto the floor. "Oops," he would say with a smirk, never bothering to pick them up. Susan May watched all this with growing concern. She had known Harold for 15 years, had served him coffee every morning, had listened to his quiet stories about Martha and the war. Now she watched as her once peaceful diner became a battleground of subtle cruelty. She tried talking to the bikers several times, but they always had excuses ready. "We're paying customers, aren't we?" they would say. Or, "We're not doing anything wrong. Maybe your other customers are just too sensitive." They would say these things with innocent faces, but their eyes told a different story. One morning, Crusher's group started a new trick. They would wait until Harold was taking a sip of his coffee. Then one of them would suddenly drop a heavy boot against the floor near his table. The noise would startle anyone, but for Harold, with his shaky hands, it meant spilled coffee. They would roar with laughter every time, calling out things like, "Better get a bib, old-timer." Harold never said a word about the spills. He would simply take the napkins that Susan quickly brought over and clean up quietly. but there was something in the way he held himself, a dignity that seemed to irritate the bikers even more. It was as if his silence was a challenge to them, though he never meant it that way. The other customers could see what was happening. Sometimes they would try to help, offering Harold extra napkins or giving the bikers disapproving looks. But the road raiders didn't care what anyone thought. They had claimed the diner as their territory, and Harold's continued presence seemed to offend them more each day. Susan started keeping a closer eye on Harold's table. She would refill his coffee more often than necessary, just to have an excuse to stand nearby. Her teenage son, Tommy, who helped out on weekends, began timing his cleaning duties to stay close to Harold's booth. But they couldn't be there all the time. One particularly cold morning, Crusher decided to take things further. As Harold was carefully cutting his breakfast sausage, Crusher walked by and stumbled, bumping the table hard enough to send Harold's plate sliding. The sausage rolled onto the floor, and bits of egg scattered across the table. "Man, you sure are messy," Crusher said loudly, looking around at his friends who were trying to hold back their laughter. "Maybe you should eat at home where you won't make such a mess." Harold looked down at his ruined breakfast, then up at Crusher. For a moment, something flickered in the old man's eyes. Not fear, but something deeper, more distant. It was the same look he got sometimes when he would stare out the window, lost in memories that no one else could see. Susan rushed over with a new plate of food, her face red with anger. "That's enough," she said firmly to Crusher. "If you can't behave like adults, you can find somewhere else to eat." Crusher held up his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, accidents happen," he said with a grin. "Right, old-timer?" Harold still didn't respond. He just started eating his new breakfast as if nothing had happened. But his hands, normally so steady despite their age, trembled slightly as he picked up his fork. The other customers in the diner that morning watched all this with a mixture of shame and helplessness. Here was a man who had lived through nearly a century, who carried himself with quiet dignity, being treated like entertainment by men who couldn't understand the depth of the person they were tormenting. What none of them knew, not even Susan, was that behind Harold's silence, memories of another time were stirring. Memories of days when he had faced much worse than a group of bullying bikers. Days when staying quiet wasn't an option. And as he sat there, carefully eating his second breakfast, something was building inside him. Something that would soon change everything. The morning that everything changed started like any other. The autumn wind rattled the windows of May's diner, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Harold arrived at his usual time, 7 o'clock a.m. sharp, his wooden cane tapping softly against the floor as he made his way to his corner booth. Susan brought his coffee right away, worried about what might happen today. She had seen the look in Crusher's eyes yesterday, that mean gleam that said he was planning something. "Maybe sit somewhere else today," she suggested quietly to Harold, but he just shook his head and gave her a small smile. At 7:30 a.m., the roar of motorcycles filled the parking lot. Today, there were more bikes than usual. Word had spread among the road raiders that Crusher had something special planned for the old man's lesson, as they called it. The bell above the door jingled constantly as they filed in, filling the diner with the smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust. Crusher walked in last, looking bigger and more intimidating than ever. His leather vest was decorated with new patches, and his boots made the floor shake with each step. He walked straight to Harold's booth, ignoring Susan's warning look. The other customers went quiet, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Well, Crusher said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Looks like someone sitting in my seat." He planted his massive hands on Harold's table, leaning down until his face was level with the old veteran's. "You see, boys," he called out to his gang, "some folks don't know when they're not wanted anymore." Harold looked up from his coffee, his blue eyes meeting Crusher's. He didn't speak, didn't move, just held his gaze steady. This seemed to anger Crusher even more. "I said," Crusher growled, his voice getting louder, "you're in my seat, old-timer." He straightened up and cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the quiet diner. "Now we can do this the easy way, or we can do this the fun way." Susan stepped forward, holding her coffee pot like a weapon. "That's enough. This is my diner, and Harold's been sitting there longer than you've been riding motorcycles." Crusher ignored her. Instead, he reached down and grabbed Harold's coffee mug, sliding it across the table. Hot coffee splashed over the sides, making a brown puddle on the white tablecloth. "Time to go, Grandpa." Some of us don't have much time left to wait." The other bikers laughed at this, but their laughter died quickly when Harold slowly stood up. Even bent with age, there was something about the way he moved that made everyone watch. He picked up his cane and took one step away from the booth. "That's right," Crusher said with a smirk. "Time to find a new breakfast spot. Maybe they got openings at the retirement home." More laughter from his gang, but it sounded forced this time. Harold took another step, then stopped. His grip tightened on his cane, and for a moment he looked down at the floor. The morning sun coming through the windows caught the silver in his hair, making it shine like a soldier's helmet. "Look at him," Crusher said loudly. "Can barely walk. People like this should stay home where they belong. Right, boys?" He turned to his gang, spreading his arms wide like he was giving a speech. "I mean, what's he gonna do? Bore us to death with stories about the good old days?" That's when Harold turned around. The movement was so sudden that Crusher actually took a step back. The old man's back was straight now, his shoulders squared, and his eyes, those eyes that had seen things these young men couldn't imagine, were sharp as steel. The whole diner seemed to hold its breath. Even the coffee machine stopped gurgling, as if it knew something important was about to happen. Susan gripped her coffee pot tighter, and Tommy stopped wiping tables to watch. No one could have guessed what would happen next, least of all Crusher. But in that moment, as Harold faced the much larger man, years seemed to fall away from his face. He wasn't just an old man in a diner anymore. He was something else entirely, something these bikers were about to learn about the hard way. The silence in May's diner was so complete you could hear the old wall clock ticking. Harold stood facing Crusher, his cane planted firmly on the floor. When he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, nothing like the quiet tones he usually used to order his breakfast. "Son," Harold said, and that one word carried such authority that several of the younger bikers straightened up without realizing it. "I've been quiet because that's my choice, not because I'm afraid." His voice filled the diner, reaching every corner like a commander addressing his troops. Crusher tried to keep his mocking smile, but it was slipping. Something about the way Harold held himself made the biker leader uncertain for the first time. "Oh yeah," Crusher said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "And why should we care about what you have to say?" Harold reached slowly into his worn brown wallet. His hands, which had been shaking earlier, were perfectly steady now. "I didn't crawl through the beaches of Normandy," he said, pulling out an old military ID card. "Watch my best friends die, and take 3 bullets to the chest so that I could be afraid of sitting in my favorite diner." The card he held up was faded with age, but the Elite Ranger's insignia was still clear as day, the same insignia that was tattooed on Crusher's arm, the one he'd gotten in honor of his father's service. Harold's name and rank were visible. Lieutenant Harold Thompson, Elite Ranger's Special Operations Unit. Susan gasped. In 15 years, Harold had never mentioned being an Elite Ranger. Everyone knew about the Elite Rangers. They were legends in military history, the Special Forces unit that had carried out the most dangerous missions during World War II. Only 1 in 10 men who tried to join the Rangers made it through training, and even fewer survived the war. 3 weeks after D-Day, Harold continued, his voice carrying the weight of memories. "My unit was sent behind enemy lines. We had to take out a German artillery position that was preventing our forces from advancing. There were 12 of us when we started. Only 3 made it back." He turned slightly, showing the right side of his neck where a thin scar was barely visible. "Got this from a German sniper. Bullet missed my jugular by less than an inch, but we completed our mission. We always completed our mission." Crusher's face had gone pale. His father had told him stories about the Elite Rangers, about their incredible bravery, and the impossible missions they undertook. How they would appear out of nowhere, strike with deadly precision, and vanish like ghosts. They were the unit other soldiers spoke about in whispers. "The Rangers had a saying," Harold said, looking each biker in the eye. "When everything else fails, Rangers lead the way." We lived by those words. We died by those words. And here I am, 93 years old, and I still live by them. He carefully put the ID card back in his wallet. "You see these hands?" He held them up, and everyone could see the scars and burn marks that years of wearing long sleeves had hidden. They've carried wounded men through gunfire, disarmed bombs, and buried brothers in foreign soil. They've killed men, and they've saved men. And now they hold coffee cups and help young Tommy carry dishes when Susan is short-staffed. The diner was absolutely still. Even the usual morning traffic outside seemed to have gone quiet. The younger bikers were looking at their boots, unable to meet Harold's gaze. Crusher stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely gone. "So no, son," Harold said, his voice gentler now, "I won't be leaving my booth. Not because I'm stubborn, but because men better than me died to give me the right to sit wherever I damn well please in this free country. And if you'd have a problem with that," here his voice took on a steel edge again, "then perhaps you need to think about what that flag on your jacket really stands for." He pointed to the American flag patch on Crusher's vest, the one that all the road raiders wore. In that moment, it wasn't Harold's combat history that commanded respect. It was the quiet dignity with which he'd endured their harassment, the same dignity with which he'd served his country all those years ago. For several long moments after Harold's words, May's diner remained as quiet as a church. Crusher stood motionless, his large frame seeming to shrink under the weight of what he'd just learned. His hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly relaxed at his sides. Then, with movements that surprised everyone, he began to unzip his leather vest. "My father," Crusher said, his voice rough with emotion, "he never talked much about the war. But when he did, he always mentioned the elite rangers." His hands were shaking slightly as he removed his vest, something none of his fellow bikers had ever seen before. Said they were the bravest men he'd ever known. Said one team of rangers saved his entire unit in France. Under his vest, Crusher wore a faded black t-shirt. On his right arm, clearly visible now, was a large tattoo. It wasn't like his other tattoos of skulls and flames. This one showed a military insignia, an Army veteran's mark, with a date and unit number underneath. "Pop served in the 104th Infantry," Crusher continued, his voice getting quieter. "December 1944. They were pinned down by German forces near the Belgian border." He looked at Harold with new eyes, searching the old man's face. Was that anywhere near where you served, sir?" Harold studied Crusher's tattoo, then nodded slowly. "The 104th. I remember them. Good men. Tough fighters." He paused, thinking back. "We ran 3 rescue operations in that area during December. The weather was brutal. Snow so deep you could barely walk." Crusher's face changed completely. The arrogant sneer was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like awe. "Pop said they were trapped for 3 days. No supplies, running out of ammo. Then one night, like ghosts in the snow, these rangers appeared. Led them through enemy lines to safety. Never even knew their names." "We never did give our names," Harold said softly. "Wasn't our way. We went where we were needed, did what had to be done, then moved on to the next mission." Tears were forming in Crusher's eyes now, something that made his fellow bikers shift uncomfortably. This was a side of their leader they'd never seen. "Pop passed away last spring," he said, his voice cracking. "But he never forgot those rangers, said he owed them everything. Said I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for them." Harold reached out and placed his weathered hand on Crusher's arm, right over the veteran's tattoo. "Your father's unit fought bravely. We were just doing our job, but those infantry boys, they held the line day after day. They were the real heroes." Crusher looked down at Harold's hand on his arm, at the scars and age spots that told their own stories of sacrifice and survival. Without warning, he dropped to one knee beside Harold's booth, bringing himself eye level with the man he'd been tormenting just minutes ago. "Sir," he said, and the word carried all the respect he should have shown from the beginning. We've all been." He struggled to find the words, shame coloring his face red. "Stand up, son," Harold said gently. "Your father wouldn't want to see you on your knees. And neither do I." Crusher stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He turned to face his gang, who were watching the scene with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "Boys," he said, his voice regaining some of its strength, "we've been disrespecting a hero. A man who saved my father's life. A man who's worth 100 of us." The other bikers began removing their caps and bandanas, showing respect the only way they knew how. The youngest among them, the one with the spiked jacket who had laughed the loudest at Harold's spilled coffee, stepped forward. "We're sorry, sir," he said, his voice small but sincere. "We didn't know. We never thought." "No, you didn't think." Crusher cut in, his tone firm but not angry. "None of us did, but that changes today." He turned back to Harold, standing straight and tall, like a soldier at attention. "Sir, if you'll allow it, I'd like to buy you a fresh cup of coffee. And maybe you could tell us about our dads, about the war, about what it really means to be brave." The atmosphere in May's diner had changed completely. Where there had been tension and fear, now there was a kind of reverent quiet. Susan brought a fresh pot of coffee and extra cups for everyone, her eyes still wet with tears from witnessing the scene that had just unfolded. Crusher pulled up a chair to Harold's booth, sitting down with the kind of care you might show in a museum. The other bikers gathered around too, pulling up chairs and even sitting on the floor. Their leather and chains seemed less threatening now, more like costumes they'd been wearing to hide their true selves. "Your father," Harold said to Crusher, pouring cream into his fresh coffee, "what was his name?" "James Miller," Crusher replied softly, but everyone called him Jimmy. His voice carried a gentleness that surprised even his closest friends. He was a radio operator in the 104th. Harold's eyes lit up with recognition. "Jimmy Miller? The tall fellow from Kansas?" He smiled, remembering. "Had a picture of a red-haired girl in his helmet, always sharing his chocolate bars with everyone." Crusher's mouth fell open in surprise. "That red-haired girl was my mom. She passed away when I was little, but Dad kept that picture until the day he died." His voice trembled. "You actually knew him?" "I remember your father well," Harold said, taking a sip of his coffee. "That night we evacuated his unit. He insisted on helping carry a wounded soldier despite being injured himself. Kept telling jokes the whole time to keep everyone's spirits up, even with German patrols all around us." One by one, other bikers began sharing stories about their own fathers and grandfathers who had served. The young one with the spiked jacket, whose name was Tommy, not to be confused with Susan's son, talked about his grandfather who had been a mechanic in the Pacific Theater. Another biker's uncle had been a medic in North Africa. Harold listened to each story with genuine interest, sometimes adding details about the units or battles they mentioned. His memory was sharp as ever when it came to the war years, and he painted pictures with his words that made everyone feel like they were there. "The thing about war," Harold said, looking at each face around him, "is that it shows you who people really are. Not the tough guy act, not the fancy uniforms, but what's in their hearts." He glanced meaningfully at Crusher. "Your father showed his true self that night. Brave, caring, putting others before himself." Crusher wiped his eyes again, not caring anymore who saw. "I've been trying so hard to be tough, to be feared," he admitted. "But Pop never wanted that. He always said true strength was in how you treated others." The other bikers nodded, shame and understanding mixing on their faces. They had all been playing at being tough guys, never realizing they were dishonoring the very values their veteran relatives had fought to protect. "Sir," Crusher said formally, standing up and addressing not just Harold but the whole diner, "on behalf of the Road Raiders, I want to apologize. To you, to Ms. Susan, and to everyone here. We've been acting like fools, and it stops today." He turned to his gang. "From now on, we show respect. We remember who we are and where we come from. We honor men like Lieutenant Thompson who gave everything so we could be free to ride our bikes and live our lives." The other bikers stood too, forming a kind of impromptu honor guard around Harold's booth. Susan watched from behind her counter, dabbing her eyes with her apron as she saw tough men transformed by the power of respect and shared history. "You know what my Martha used to say?" Harold asked, looking around at the group. "She'd say that it's never too late to start over. She was right about most things, that woman." He smiled, a kind of smile that carried both joy and sadness. "So what do you say, boys? Shall we start over?" Crusher extended his hand to Harold. "We'd be honored, sir. And if you're willing, we'd like to hear more about our dads, about the war, about everything." "Well then," Harold said, shaking Crusher's hand firmly, "pull up those chairs and get comfortable. Susan, we might need more coffee. This could take a while." 3 months had passed since that life-changing morning at May's Diner, and anyone walking in today would hardly recognize the place. The atmosphere had completely transformed, and it all centered around Harold's corner booth, which had become something of a sacred space in the community. Every morning at 7 a.m., Harold would arrive as usual, but he never walked alone anymore. There was always at least one road raider waiting outside his house to escort him. They had worked out a schedule among themselves, taking turns to make sure their lieutenant, as they now called him, had company on his daily walk. Crusher was there most often, having moved his auto repair business to Burlington just to be closer. He had changed the most of all the bikers. Gone was the intimidating figure who had terrorized the diner. In his place was a man who carried himself with quiet respect, who pulled out Harold's chair for him and made sure his coffee was always hot. The corner booth had been transformed too. Above it hung a carefully framed shadow box containing military medals, not just Harold's, but those of the bikers' fathers and grandfathers as well. Each medal had a small plaque telling its story, creating a wall of honor that customers would often stop to read. "Tell us about the time in Belgium again," young Tommy, the former spike jacket wearer, would often say. He had traded his aggressive accessories for a simple leather vest with an American flag pin, a gift from Harold. The other bikers would gather around, some standing, some sitting, all listening intently even though they'd heard the stories many times before. Susan had to buy more coffee cups to handle the morning crowd. The road raiders had become regular fixtures, but instead of scaring customers away, they now attracted them. People came from all over town to see the unlikely friendship between the elderly veteran and the biker gang, and to hear the stories they shared. On busy mornings, the bikers helped serve coffee and clear tables. Their leather vests and tattoos now seemed to comfort rather than frighten other customers. Children especially loved them, and the bikers would often lift the little ones up to see the medals on the wall, explaining what each one meant. Harold's health had improved too. The daily walks with his biker escorts had strengthened his legs, and the constant conversation kept his mind sharp. He stood straighter now, and his hands shook less when he held his coffee cup. The respect and friendship of these young men had given him new energy. The road raiders had changed in other ways as well. They still rode their motorcycles, but now they organized charity rides for veterans' causes. Their reputation in the community had shifted from troublemakers to protectors. When Harold mentioned that the local veterans' hospital needed volunteers, the entire gang signed up the next day. Every Sunday, they would gather at the diner for what they called family breakfast. The bikers would bring their wives, girlfriends, and children. Harold sat at the head of the table like a beloved grandfather, teaching the kids about honor and respect through his gentle stories. Susan would cook special meals for these gatherings, and the sound of laughter would fill the diner. Crusher had started recording Harold's stories, writing them down in a leather-bound journal. "These need to be preserved," he'd say. "Our kids and grandkids need to know about men like you, sir." The other bikers contributed too, adding their father's stories to create a living history of sacrifice and courage. One morning, as Harold watched Crusher teaching his young daughter how to properly fold an American flag, he thought about how life could surprise you. At 93, when he thought his quiet days would just fade one into the next, he had found a new family. These men, who had once tried to chase him away, now guarded his honor as fiercely as they would their own fathers. "You know what, boys?" Harold said, looking around at his unlikely brotherhood. "Martha would have loved all this." His eyes twinkled as he added, "though she might have made you wipe your boots more often." The laughter that followed was warm and genuine, filling every corner of May's diner. It was the sound of barriers broken, of prejudices overcome, of respect earned and given. But most of all, it was the sound of family, not the kind you're born into, but the kind you find when you least expect it, in a corner booth of a small-town diner.